Welcome back, friends. Here we are. Gonna make a little transition here. Gonna get away from all of that male-driven, testosterone-driven rock. Uh, Deal with some marginal voices here. All right. Yeah, I think what is this talk called? Reversal and explosion through marginal voices. Fittingly enough. Yeah, Alanis, NWA, and the poetry of vulgarity. Vulgarity. I'm already sold. Yeah, I'm in. I'm all in. Give me some vulgarity. It was late October. Here we go again. Anecdote time. Late October, early November of 1996. I can't actually remember which month it was. I was on my midterm holiday while studying abroad in England. It was pretty awesome, actually. I was 21 years old, studying British literature and history at St. Anne's College, Oxford University. And I had a 10-day break, not at the end of the term, but right in the middle of my term, which was kind of odd. But anyway, I traveled with, a few of my friends that I had made since venturing over abroad. And, we went to Paris for a few days. We went to Geneva, Switzerland for a couple of nights where one evening we ended up getting locked out of our hostel because we stayed out past curfew. That's a no-no, or at least it was a no-no back in the day. I ended up sleeping on park benches next to Lake Leman, Lake Geneva. Spent a night or two in Brussels, and then we ended up, spending our last couple of evenings in Amsterdam. Listen, I don't mean to be cliche, but I was 21 years old. And yeah, we were all excited about traveling to a city where weed was legal. I can admit it. I'm now past middle age, so in retrospect, Amsterdam was the most obvious of choices, as it was for probably 99% of American college students traveling abroad in the 1990s. I do remember our arrival quite clearly. It was an early morning, and we got to the train station and begrudgingly hauled our backpacks from the train station to the hostel, which was only a few blocks away, 10-minute walk. But the hostel, well, not the hostel, but Amsterdam in general at the time had kind of a sketchy reputation. It wasn't just known for legal weed, but it was also notorious for having a fairly serious heroin epidemic at the time. So we were all a little tad skittish concerning this hostel we had never seen. And after making our way to the hostel, our expectations were well met. I think it was called Bob's Youth Hostel. And in so many words, it was a shithole. All that has really struck with me from that place is an image of a lot of broken glass, young kids. I was 21 years old at the time, so probably younger than me, trying to sell us drugs, and a stench that I can only compare to a smell of, I don't know, venturing below Canal Street in the days and weeks following 9/11. A smell that I will never forget. Anyway, I remember when we got there, we immediately grabbed our Lost Planet travel guide and getting the hell out of Bob's Youth Hostel. Side note, well before cell phones and GPS and all of that type of stuff or Google searches. So we actually had to use books. So we were lucky enough to find an affordable B&B. And it was within walking distance, and it had vacancy, so we lucked out. And after the relief of finding a place that didn't have, I don't know, creepy, pimple-faced young Germans offering us cheap ecstasy, we dropped off our bags at our B&B and headed out into Amsterdam on this chilly late fall morning, looking for the one thing that we were there for: coffee shops. Nice euphemism. I still don't remember if it was the Bulldog or the Grasshopper where we ended up. At the time, those were the two most touristy and well-known establishments for legal marijuana. 20 some years later, it doesn't really make a difference which one we ended up. But at about 10 o'clock in the morning, we found what we were looking for. And after settling into a corner nook next to the front window overlooking a picturesque canal, the waiter brought us the menu, and within minutes we ordered various edibles, cakes, shakes, candies, along with all of the necessary accoutrements to help roll our own joints. Finally, after consuming our first legal Amsterdam THC, we began to just sit there and chat and wait. And soon enough, we started giggling as we just chilled out and took in our surroundings. And then it happened. The coffee shop started to play music. I think we all kind of noticed it in the background, but it took a while for the specifics of the noise to truly register. Time passed with seeming ease, but then I remember my buddy Heath, looking at me, and he exclaimed, "Have they been playing Alanis Morissette this entire fucking time?" And we all burst out laughing. It's still funny. And it was true. The music that started playing, I'm not really sure how long before, was Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill, her 1995 album. And it was playing the entire album. And I'm pretty sure, in retrospect, I think it was being played on repeat. As the confusion, I recall, really started to set in. And I had no clue how much time actually had passed. I just remember hearing Alanis again and again and again. Needless to say, this was not the preferred background music for 21-year-old pot smokers experiencing their first hours in Amsterdam. I remember quite clearly when one of our fellow travelers exclaimed, "I can't handle this. I need to get the fuck out of here, man." Oh, shit. I just lied. It was me that uttered those words. Yeah. Anyway, amidst the confusion, within minutes, we were off to find another coffee shop that matched our desired ambiance. Now, this was 1996, and for, I guess, a brief moment, I had gotten away from my Seattle roots in Guns N' Roses in favor of Oasis. As What's the Story, Morning Glory, it was in the midst of blowing up around the globe. I mean, I was living in England at the time. You really can't blame me for just, jumping on the Oasis bandwagon. I mean, it was good. It still is good. At the same time, this was the moment in my life where I, first began to fancy myself as a writer of some kind. And I had recently discovered, Pink Floyd's Animals, an album, actually a CD, that I would listen to an hour's repeat as I would write incessantly about, me. I mean, I was 21. Nevertheless, Alanis Morissette, in my mind, was conventional radio music that garnered attention for reasons I was not yet mature enough to understand. In my very underdeveloped mind, it was pop rock, an erroneous categorization. We just spoke about genre in my previous talk. This was, a poor attempt on my part at putting up a border, an ill-informed border. Yeah. And it was an erroneous categorization that, in retrospect, I regret dismissing. But I do understand how my 21-year-old self was not yet prepared for such important lyricism. Listen, I've never encapsulated the frat boy mentality. However, there's no doubt, there's no doubt that in retrospect, I certainly looked the part. Not one of those annoying, Southern frat boys, in khakis and a button down with his sunglasses turned around backwards. Not a Midwestern frat boy, wearing TiVos and a Dave Matthews t-shirt. Not a hippie frat boy, with a tie-dye and a steal-your-face hat reeking of patchouli. All of these incredible stereotypes I'm playing with. Oh, boy. By the way, on a side note, just to clarify, I was never really actually in a frat. But none of that shit. But I was still fairly conventional in terms of my appearance. Kind of stinking of, affluent suburbs. A little 90210 mixed with grunge, but not real grunge. Yes, I did just use the G word, which I do think is acceptable in terms of appearance, but never with musical genre. I wore Doc Martens, flannel shirts. Jeez, I'm still wearing a flannel shirt. And even though my hair was long, a lot longer than it is now, it was usually, I used to slick it back with expensive product. Always kind of thwarting any attempt to truly look alternative. I was simply a little too conventional, I guess, to be considered grungy. That's the reality, as much as I wished otherwise. Furthermore, I remember about a decade later, when I was teaching in graduate school at Fordham, one of my early Rate My Professor reviews stated, "Great class. But the frat boy poet thing is kind of unnerving. Yeesh. At the time, I was furious, feeling utterly defeated in my early attempts at steering clear from any kind of conformity. Yet over the years, I've grown to appreciate that comment. I'm not going to go off on another rant concerning hipsters and their attempts at intentional irony, but I've always kind of despised intentional irony, especially when the construction reflects, the reality. That's actually not irony at all. For me, with language, culture, and individual realities, I've always preferred, surprises, actual irony. Hence the paradox of the conventional frat boy image blended with a poetic sensibility. You know what? Works fine for me. If it's a surprise, all the better. I haven't looked at that website, rate my professor in years. In my early days, first teaching, I used to, love it. To get to listen to what my students had to say unfiltered. Now I don't give a shit what you have to say. But with all that said, even though in 1996 I was quick to dismiss the music of Alanis Morissette, it was by no means a misogynistic dismissal that you would expect from a stereotypical frat boy. To reiterate, it was a dismissal based solely on immaturity and lack of experience. I was a kid. This was the 1990s, well before woke politics became a thing. Yeah, thrusting present day morality onto the past, even immediate past, is quite problematic. Nobody is born with an innate sense of morality or right versus wrong. We learn this shit over time. Similarly, we have to unlearn over time. That's life in a nutshell. It's a constant overcoming and a constant becoming. We are continually growing. Hence, I really don't blame myself for my early dismissal of Alanis. The whole idea of wokeness, it began with the right intentions and a legitimate agenda. However, like so many quote unquote movements, it undermined its own intentions by ignoring nuance and context, especially temporal context. Yeah, in 1996, I did not have the awareness or sense of empathy that I had in 2005 or that I even have today. Again, that stuff takes time. Over the years, I guess I've had, stupid days as a quote unquote ladies' man. And I've had some shitty moments that I regret. One night stands or even bragging to my friends about certain exploits. Adolescent bullshit. But I'm comfortable enough in my own skin to know that I've never intentionally meant to hurt a woman. And I've learned from my mistakes. That's what actual human beings do. They recognize their shortcomings and they unfuck themselves when they fuck up. I don't expect my students in their 20s to already have all of the answers. That's why they're in the classroom. So yeah, I dismissed Alanis at first, but not because I was a misogynist, but because I was young. Indeed, there's nothing easy about knowledge. However, there was an understanding within me that just needed some time and I guess some good graduate courses. Empathy may be the most important character trait, especially when it comes to marginal figures and groups. But it's a trait that certainly is not innate. We're not born with it. It was empathy combined with maturity that later allowed me to not just appreciate, but to freaking love, female rockers and artists such as, I don't know, Heart, Veruca Salt and the Donnas, two bands, both of them who disappeared way too quickly. They kicked so much ass. Slater Kinney, Cat Power, St. Vincent, Natalie Maines, Miley, Billie Eilish, Wet Leg. I have an entire talk dedicated to Wet Leg. I can't wait for you to hear that. And so many more. Alas, in getting back to my days in Oxford, or more specifically that morning in Amsterdam, female agency was something that I appreciated, but I did not quite understand. I remember thinking that female empowerment, especially through the words of Alanis, I thought it just felt forced. And in reality, I did not grasp that in actuality, it probably had to be forced to garner attention. Christ, I had just discovered James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, and at 21 years old, my pretentiousness was possibly at its peak. I still thought that I was the only person on the planet who truly understood T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. In reality, I understood very little about that poem, but that's part of being young. You think you know everything. Indeed, it wasn't until I was in graduate school in New York 6 or 7 years later that I discovered the poetry of Letitia Elizabeth Landon, better known by her initials, LEL, and soon enough truly began to appreciate not just the music, but more importantly, the words of Alanis. So Letitia Elizabeth Landon's interesting. She was born in London in 1802. More professor moments for me. Yeah, and I guess if location ever made a difference, location really made a difference for Landon. She lived adjacent to a girls' school which she attended. She became a voracious reader at an early age, taking a liking to writing poetry in her teens. Another of her neighbors was a gentleman by the name of William Jordan, the editor of the Literary Gazette, one of the more popular literary journals at the time. And Jordan recognized the young girl's talent early on and began to publish Landon's work when she was in her late teens. Talk about location. Nevertheless, Landon, initially published her works anonymously, soon enough signing her works just with an L, and then LEL. And the mystery surrounding her identity led to public infatuation. Her works were not of the ilk of other female romantic poets such as Felicia Hemans or even Charlotte Smith. They were more challenging, more mysterious in terms of identity, especially the identity afforded to female writers in the early 19th century. When her identity as a female was finally revealed, it only added to the public infatuation. And with the death of our buddy Lord Byron in 1824, Landon quickly filled the void as the most talked about writer, maybe the most gossiped about writer in all of England. Being a female poet in a very male centric profession, was challenging for Landon. A single woman most of her life who had to bear public scrutiny and gossip that was grounded in misogyny and the expectations that came along with being a woman writer in the early 19th century. Still, Landon was a prolific writer, churning out not just poetry, but also what were known as silver fork novels. They were there to appeal to the upper crust, kind of over the top, bad romances. She also wrote, gift books, and she wrote criticism that was actually pretty good. But it was Landon's life that usurped her art in the most Byronic of manners. There's a reason that Landon has come to be known as the female Byron. Scandal followed her all around. Speculation of her love life, rumors of her, bearing children out of wedlock. To the day, there's still much speculation according to the legitimacy of these rumors. Yet Landon finally did marry in 1838 in her mid-30s and moved to the Gold Coast of Africa with her husband, the naval officer George McLean. And within a matter of months, Landon was found dead, resulting in even more gossip and speculation. Ruled an accidental overdose of prussic acid, which is basically just diluted cyanide that she would take for her epileptic fits, seizures. The rumors only increased, leading to speculation of suicide. Her letters home at the time were not flattering concerning her life in Africa, and she dearly missed her friends in London and dearly missed London itself. So, even possibly murder, the rumors spread the murder, maybe at the hands of her husband, who potentially had a native mistress. Again, like previous speculation, most of these rumors were unfounded. But it became in vogue to write biographies of Landon's life in the early days of the Victorian era. Alas, with all the intrigue regarding Landon's actual life, it's really her work that interests me, especially her short lyric entitled Revenge. So, go ahead and look it up. Yeah, go right ahead. It's very easy. Just throw it into Google, write LEL Revenge, and it'll pop right up. Take a moment, read it. It's short. Press pause on me, then come back. All right. Read it a couple times if you need to. Now that you're done, hopefully reading it, let's have a little chat. So at first glance, the poem is seemingly nothing more than an intimation by a female speaker, desiring vengeance against an ex-lover. Some serious Taylor Swift shit for the most part. Don't worry, we're going to come back to T Swizzle soon enough. However, there's so much more going on. The lyric is not too complex, but let's create a little context for the underlying yearning for vengeance. We have a clear triangular dynamic, within this narrative. We have our speaker's ex-bay. That's what my students usually call them, so I'll abide by their wishes. Along with the ex's new babe. A few years ago, one of my students actually referred to this new woman as a thought, THOT. Which I had to look up on an Urban Dictionary. I didn't know what it meant. And as inappropriate as it may sound, it actually makes sense. Furthermore, it's the first person speaker who clearly is the one reveling in her revenge, okay? The sex of the speaker is never mentioned. And there could be, a very cool contemporary queer reading of this poem. For now, we're going to focus more on the more evident reality of the sexes of these three participants. But how exactly is our speaker getting revenge? Well, this goes to the basic question of what exactly our speaker is doing. She does not appear to be participating in any kind of action. She does not interact with the other two individuals within the poem. There's zero dialogue. However, if you look closely, the answer is obvious. She's watching. She's noticing. She is gazing. Indeed, from the very first line, Landon may be toying with phonetic playfulness, as she writes, "I gaze upon her rose-wreathed hair." Now, the word "I" signifies a sense of affirmation, as in, "I, mate," or "yes, go ahead and look at her." However, when hearing the poem, the word may also be referencing what our poet speaker in the first person is actually doing, especially considering later lines where the speaker is clearly aware of something that her ex does not see. Subsequently, the speaker is noticing, the eye averted as you passed spoke more than words could speak, suggesting that her ex is unaware of his new babe's wandering eye. This is supported by the fact that the new woman's eye will not turn on thee, the speaker's ex. This is what our speaker is noticing, what her gaze is offering her. Yeah, what he's offering her is that her ex is about to be totally fucked, for he is not beloved. However, the gazing is more than significant. The gazing is paramount, especially in a poem written by a woman in the 19th century. For 2,000 years, women had mostly been depicted as, objects, muses, for the male poet to look upon and to find inspiration. I know it's creepy AF, but it's a pervasive trope, especially among the bigger names. Homer calls up his muse at the very beginning of the Odyssey. Dante had his Beatrice or Beatrice, some woman he never even spoke to but once saw in the streets of Florence, who inspired him to write an epic poem about going through the 9 circles of hell. Fuck me. Petrarch had his Laura. Shakespeare, his Dark Lady of the Sonnets, who most likely was a dude. The list goes on and on. On a side note, this is one of the reasons why I always hated that James Blunt song from the early 2000s about him once seeing some woman on the subway and falling in love. Try talking to her, dude, not writing a creepy ass song about her. This is the traditional dynamic. The male poet gazing upon the female object and being filled with the power to create. However, in Landon's lyric, this dynamic drastically shifts. With revenge, there's a clear sense of reversal. The female poet speaker is now in the position of doing the gazing. And man, does she enjoy what she is seeing. Being a jilted lover, she is now looking and noticing all that you taught my heart to bear, all that yourself will know. Not only does agency return to our speaker due to her positioning as the gazer, but there exists a striking sense of voyeurism. She's actually getting off, metaphorically speaking, from what she's witnessing. The thwarted love of her ex, who is unaware of how his new object of desire truly feels about him. His love will not be returned, and the speaker feeds upon his pain. Furthermore, the lyric goes well beyond voyeurism. It's actually quite sadistic, as the speaker does not wish to see him dead. Yeah, as Landon writes, I would not wish to see you laid within an early tomb. And more importantly, she wants him to suffer. Similarly, the imagery in the last stanza suggests that not only does she want him to suffer, she desires torture, the rack, the chain, the wheel, torture devices. Shit, this is someone that I would never want to piss off. Nevertheless, the power of the poem remains in the hands of a woman, and this is quite a woman, especially considering the time period. Think about what comes with being a female in the early 19th century. Well, through the dynamic of marriage or any relationship between man and woman, there are obvious expectations: obedience, subordination, tacit propriety. Women were reserved to the domestic sphere and expected to be seen, not heard. Sure, with women, emotions were expected, but typically these were soft emotions. Like if her heart was broken, you would expect her to weep uncontrollably before throwing herself into the River Thames. But seeking revenge, that's what men were expected to do, to coordinate the duel for vengeance if one's honor had been wronged. That's manly shit. However, what we have in the Landon poem is a complete reversal of expectations. Her poet speaker is pissed off. She is angry. She wants retribution, and she finds a great deal of pleasure in someone else being subjugated to the pain she also confronted. Her poet speaker loves this, and most importantly, is in the position to witness all of it. It is a lyric of stark affirmation, and yes, this is what we would call an early feminist poem. And for those of you out there who are uncomfortable with this word or do not like it, stop being such insecure children. Indeed, feminism and reversal go hand in hand. Don't listen to the Fox News commentators. Feminism is not about women replacing men. As Mary Wollstonecraft so aptly put it in her 1793 brilliant early feminist work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she does not wish to invert the order of things. I think I already mentioned this in a previous talk, but Wollstonecraft is always worth repeating. From its origins, feminism has been about equal representation and having the same rights, freedoms, and liberties as men. As this should also be the case with non-binary identities and their present plight. Indeed, feminism is not about reversing the patriarchy. It's about abolishing the patriarchy or any kind of hegemonic superstructure that marginalizes difference. Hegemonic superstructure. Holy shit, I did just sound like an English professor. Sorry. But feminism's not an inversion or a desire to marginalize anyone. It's a rupturing of the very notion of marginalization. Yes, women can be pissed off too. Women can be angry and desire retribution. Women can be in the position of the gazer as well. That's it. So stop getting all butthurt, to borrow from one of my favorite Southern phrases I learned when I first moved to Louisiana. Oh, I've learned so much. Alas, this brings me back to Alanis and her 1995 seminal masterpiece, You Ought to Know, off of Jagged Little Pill, a single that catapulted her to worldwide fame. So it's one of those moments again. So I would like you to go ahead and listen to the song while reading the lyrics. But again, pay attention to the lyrics and pay attention to the sound. Go ahead, press pause, come back to me in 5 minutes. Now, taken in conjunction with Letitia Elizabeth Landon's lyric, the connection is fairly obvious. We have another very pissed off woman who has no problem voicing her disdain for her ex. Indeed, there are some seriously awesome moments in this lyric. The searing irony of the first two lines. I want you to know that I'm happy for you. I wish nothing but the best for you both. The vitriolic power of the chorus. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. Other moments of, stark confession. You seem well. Things look peaceful. I'm not quite as well I thought you should know. And that moment, that really resonates, I think, with most likely everyone who has ever listened to the song. And every time I scratch my nails down someone else's back, I hope you feel it. Yeah, can you feel it? Uh huh. All of this makes for a striking lyric that is still difficult to ignore almost 3 decades later. However, in terms of poetry, I'm interested in one aspect of the lyric in particular. And at first, it might seem as if I'm grasping at low-hanging fruit in terms of what the audience would most likely expect. Yeah, I'm talking about the moments of potential vulgarity. Honestly, I actually don't think this use of language is low hanging fruit at all, and truly provides a lot more than mere obscenity. Expletives themselves are rhetorically and logically powerful, and there's a reason for their usage, not just for shits and giggles. um, yeah. Morissette's use of expletives are, they're quite different than my own, mainly owing to the fact that, well, at times, let's just say a middle aged child, and yeah, those words still make me giggle. Yet, when the song broke through the public consciousness, the language was shocking. How could a woman reference public fellatio? How could a woman drop an F bomb? How could a woman be seemingly so sexual and angry? Yeah, again, all of this exacerbated by her vitriolic tone. Whew. All over me, just spilled all over me. That's all right. That's what a 30-year-old flannel's there for, to wipe it off. Anyway, we're about to have another discussion of genre. Truly, the sound is important. The genre is important. It's a rock song. Yes, it's kind of alternative and kind of indie, but at its core, this is rock and roll. Interestingly enough, the session musicians in the studio were Flea and Dave Navarro from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. This was that moment in the 90s when John Frusciante, the Peppers' usual guitarist, was on one of his, let's just say, a leave of absence. And Dave Navarro from Jane's Addiction, he subbed in for a couple of years. So yeah, the music's rocking. We have heavy distorted guitars, a sick bass line, matched with the wail of an awesome lead singer. And we all know what comes with rock and roll. We know the cliche, sex and drugs. Indeed, this is where the power of Morissette's language comes into play. And I'm talking about her use of expletives and the sexual innuendos. Like I said, even in 1995, this was shocking to many. Yet, given the genre, should it really have been shocking at all? Taking a cursory glance back at the tradition of, the rock god, sex has always been at the forefront of rock music. Do I even need to mention Van Halen's video for Hot for Teacher or the lyrics? Or how about Warrant's Cherry Pie? However, this motif goes well beyond bad 80s hair metal. Ooh, careful. I'm talking about Warrant here, not Van Halen. They kick lots of ass. But we can go to the greats. We can go to the golden god himself, Robert Plant. Some of you may recognize that phrase, golden god, comes from the film Almost Famous from 2000 when Billy Crudup's character, he's on LSD and standing on top of the roof and screams, "I'm a golden god," all right, which was apparently taken from an actual moment when Robert Plant himself made this not so subtle proclamation. Awesome. Even one of the iconic bands in rock history. I mean, they were celebrated by the Kennedy Center for the Arts. Led Zeppelin had no problem being in your face sexually, both literally and figuratively. All right. For the former, go and watch clips from their 1975 movie. The song remains the same. And check out the live footage of a shirtless Rob standing on stage right in front of you, painted on jeans. The camera right there. So Rob Jr. also is right there for your viewing pleasure, if you get what I mean. But then, take a listen to A Whole Lot of Love, all right? Maybe the greatest guitar riff ever. You can hear Rob singing, how he's going to give you every inch of his love. Better yet, go to Led Zeppelin 2. And take a moment to listen to their version of Howlin' Wolf's Killin' Floor, which they retitled the Lemon Song. There is a lot of lemon juice being squeezed in this song. It doesn't take a linguistic scholar to unpack those lyrics. However, point being, you give a white male lead singer of a rock band the mic and he can pretty much say whatever he wants and no one bats an eye. Of course, the conservative right always has a problem with any sort of obscenity or sexuality, well, because they're the conservative right. Yet all of a sudden, a young white woman references a blowjob in a movie theater, and the world has turned upside down. We're now on the brink of moral corruption, as white dudes with dicks can sing about whatever they want, but someone with a vagina must never, ever mention any of the unmentionables. Alas, I would argue that Morissette's use of this type of language is exactly what makes her lyric poetic. If poetry has the ability to defamiliarize, as I've already mentioned, or show ordinary things in an extraordinary manner, as we saw previously in my last discussion, then this is exactly what Morissette's words accomplish. These types of words are sometimes rhetorically necessary to garner attention and representation that ordinary language fails to convey. Her word choice is an affirmation of women in the face of subjugation by puritanical white evangelicalism, and the language is what constructs this affirmation. Through her poetry and ironic reversal, Morissette takes on the role of the traditional rock star, a role that is typically reserved for white men. Now, Morissette was not the only female artist affirming her identity as a woman through explicit lyricism in the mid-90s. She was actually tame compared to other female rockers at the time, specifically L7 and the incomparable Liz Phair, whose Exit in Guyville from 1993 took sordid lyricism to a level really never before seen. Her song entitled Fucking Run, pretty much speaks for itself in terms of reversal. As women clearly are no longer reserved to the traditional expectations of innocent, vulnerable objects to be exploited by men, both visually and physically. All right. For a better discussion of that song specifically, go ahead and look up my buddy Rob Harvilla's 60 songs that explain the 90s for a good in-depth reading of Fucking Run. Yet her other song, Flower, is the lyric that always stuck out to me in terms of complexity and poetry. Between confessional utterances such as, I want to be your blowjob queen, and I want to fuck you like a dog, I'll take you home and make you like it, is the wonderful titular moment of, your face reminds me of a flower. I actually think that without this one line, the entire lyric would be little more than titillating eroticism. However, this one line truly offers a striking moment in terms of the notion of reversal. Taken at first, the line signifies a simple offering of affection, but with the surrounding lyrics, we know that there is more to be unpacked. Thinking more metaphorically, if the flower is the vehicle of comparison, we must think about the characteristics of a flower, and we cannot ignore the surrounding context of hypersexuality. If a flower is to be pollinated, and now this young boy's face is the supplement for the flower, then whoa, talk about reversal. Juxtaposed with the other imagery, this line puts the more explicit lyrics to shame in terms of poetic relevancy and poignancy. Every time I read it, I can't help but think about Edna St. Vincent Millay's brilliant ironic poem, Spring, from 1921. It's badass. I mean, Millay truly is badass. I hate to use this word, but what we have here is a complete deconstruction of traditional expectations in terms of the signification of spring. All of the beauty, grace, privileging, and rebirth BS that we typically find with the season becomes empty, mere artifice devoid of agency. Thinking about this in conjunction with being a woman such as Millay in the early 20th century and the expected propriety of women as mere objects, then yes, this is a true fuck you to the emptiness of mere beauty. Indeed, mere beauty is nothing. It's actually an idiot, as the poem signifies the importance of locating agency beyond appearance, beyond expectations, and beyond simplicity. And going back to fair as flower, the significance of reversal is magnified tenfold. Women are not just the beautiful objects for men to pollinate. Women also have the ability to dominate men sexually. And why the hell not? In the long-standing tradition of rock music, whether lyrically or visually, the man is the dominant power. The man gazes at the woman. The woman is the simple object to be looked upon and exploited solely for the satisfaction of the man. Hence, Fair's ironic twist signifies an affirmation that affords women a sense of agency that we typically would not find. This is the foundation for what we call third wave feminism. Now, obviously, some of these other female artists are more brash than Morissette. However, it was Morissette who brought this mentality to the mainstream. What these female artists accomplished was a striking statement. Women don't just have the ability to be rock stars. Women are rock stars. Of course, this type of lyricism is not always necessary for poetry and art. However, at times, assertive, shocking language is completely necessary to grab the attention of a public that tends to alienate their roles, not just as women, but as artists as well. Hence the importance of reversing traditional, commonly accepted dynamics. What LEL accomplishes in Revenge, and what Morissette gladly picks up on in her lyric. Subsequently, in getting back to the notion of reversal, well, this is not an easy endeavor in or out of the realm of art, especially for marginalized groups. At its core, the concept of reversal requires the attention of others. Others, I might just say, the center, who typically are not interested in what the marginal groups have to say. With Morissette, we're clearly talking about the patriarchy. And if you want to poke the patriarchy, you've got to get them to pay attention. And gaining the attention of those who do not appear to care about what you have to say sometimes takes force. Alas, this takes me to rap music. Specifically the early days of gangster rap. I still recall the look on my mother's face when she saw her 16-year-old white son, me, rolling into the driveway of our nice home in our affluent suburb, windows rolled down in her red Audi, singing along with Dre, Easy, Cube, Yella, and Ren. NWA scared the shit out of white America when it hit, and probably as it should have. But not because it was violent and vulgar, but because it was dangerous. And by dangerous, I mean this. It was a threat to the way of the world. It was a wake-up call to white America. It was similar to why Plato wanted the poets expelled from his Republic, all right? In Book 10 of the Republic, Plato calls for the poets to be exiled, mainly owing to the fact that their words are distant imitations of reality, which results, in so many words, in the stirring of emotion and potential dissent. So, NWA was a threat, mainly because it had the ability to make you see and make you see anew. I would argue that NWA went about it in the only way they could. Now, over the past few years, this lyric has once again garnered attention for other reasons in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the ubiquity of police brutality. But in the mid to late 80s, without the advantages, this is a questionable word on my part, advantages of cell phones and the ability to share information almost instantaneously, getting the attention of the public at large, or the attention of media and political figures of importance, was not an easy endeavor, especially for a group of Black youths from South Central Los Angeles. With the horrific amount of police brutality occurring at the time in Compton and its surrounding vicinities, displaying the realities of a particular environment to the rest of the world, who would rather not know or not acknowledge the realities of a place. I mean, the place might as well have been Timbuktu. It was a daunting task. I cannot see the effectiveness of Cube or Dre dressed in sharp suits walking into the office of their local legislator's office to voice their opinion as being very fruitful. This is where art comes into play. And almost half a century prior, Langston Hughes displayed the realities of the public alienating a significant part of their culture. A giant of the Harlem Renaissance, Hughes' short lyric entitled Harlem from 1951, is a poem that perfectly captures what happens when a marginal section of culture is constantly ignored. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Yeah, it's some intense stuff. The descriptive similes abundantly detail the potential effect of ignoring or deferring a place or a culture's potential. They dry, fester, stink, crust over, or sag. All of these words signify a type of annoyance. You can almost hear, white America moaning in irritation at the plight of African Americans, either in the 1950s or, well, even today in many sections of America. Yet Hughes' final line, smacks you in the face. To constantly marginalize one's plight. Well, don't be surprised if the growing annoyance results in a metaphorical explosion. Something loud, something that's going to grab your attention, something destructive to outdated modes of thought. Fuck the police. Alas, as shocking as NWA's words were in 1987, taken in conjunction with Hughes' warning, the genesis of their utterance really should not be shocking at all. This is what happens when, oh God, I'm going to say it again, a hegemonic superstructure, constantly defers a marginal group's reality. And the resulting explosion is not just expected, it is necessary. Sometimes an explosion is the only means to grab the attention of those who are not paying attention. Some things just fester for too long. Hence, there's really nothing obscene about NWA's lyric at all. I actually remember quite clearly teaching this in the spring of 2011 when I was at Fordham, and an incredible conversation occurred in the classroom as one of my students asked if NWA really needed to use this kind of language. Another student responded with, yes, everyday language would never get the point across. And this is exactly why the words of NWA are poetry. Wow, I just sat back there and smiled, taking it all in. Now, listen, I've been a scholar of poetry for over 20 years. And in so doing, I've come across a multitude of definitions of poetry from both poets and literary critics alike. And so let me tell you, there really is not too much agreement on what the word poetry actually means. Just to run you through a few of these definitions. For Plato, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, poetry was a type of language bent on lies that needed to be ousted from his republic due to its ability to stir the emotions and lead to dissent, neither of which you can have in a nation state founded on reason and uniformity. On a side note, Plato was fine with poetry that praised his nation state. It's freaking eerie. For both Wordsworth and Coleridge, poetry was a form of language that involved dissonance and the discord of oppositional elements. For Wordsworth, it was, the combination of passion and deep contemplation. As mentioned in the previous discussion, poetry is a language that signifies, a defamiliarizing quality. A notion, by the way, that is echoed by 20th and 21st century philosopher Jay-Z. Now, this is true. In his 2010 book, Decoded, a book on literary criticism and rap lyrics, Jay-Z equates the MC to a poet, as both have the ability to use language to display ordinary words in unusual ways, making the conversation in my classroom all the more relevant. Listen, there's really not too much I can offer in terms of literary analysis of rap lyrics that Jay-Z does not already cover in his seminal work. His book, Decoded, it needs to be on syllabi at the university level, owing both to its importance and to its just utter brilliance. Anyway, and then there's the metaphorical use of poetry. I think I mentioned this briefly in our previous discussion. You know what I mean. We've all heard this ubiquitous employment of the word poetry, as in Michael Jordan's fadeaway is pure poetry, or Tiger Woods' golf swing is poetic. You hear it all the time with sports announcers, but do we really know why? Uh, Geez, do any of the announcers even understand why they're using this term? I mean, I seriously doubt Tony Romo or Kirk Herbstreit, have read much poetry. I'd love to be wrong about this stereotype. Yet, if you really think about it, this meta usage of poetry, it makes a lot of sense for our present discussion. In this employment, poetry becomes a type of surrogate. It fills a gap created by the limitations of everyday words. Yet, when ordinary words simply enough do not suffice, the word poetry becomes a supplement. So with Michael Jordan, ordinary words are not enough. We cannot say that his fadeaway is awesome, amazing, or great. That's too easy. I mean, these words are too simple and do not capture the reality of the situation. These words lack something that poetry includes, mainly that which cannot accurately be captured even vis-a-vis language. The word poetry signifies an inability of human beings to completely cognize a certain situation or experience. There's inherently an aspect of not just mystery surrounding poetry, but also what I would call the immaterial. Now, in my final discussion, we're really going to get into this concept of the immaterial. But for now, yeah, the immaterial. Hence, in going back to Alanis and NWA, their use of expletives, it becomes poetic due to the fact that, ordinary language simply fails to capture the reality. Indeed, these explosions certainly gained attention and in an affirming manner. Now, the issue with this type of affirmation, whether through sexuality or whether through expletives, is that inevitably it'll turn into exploitation. And we see this both with women and with rap music. Specifically, sometime in the 1990s, once the affirming, in your face power of gangster rap was slowly waning, a lot of rap quickly became, all about just bitches and bling. Okay, on a side note, I actually kind of got in trouble for saying that exact phrase aloud in the classroom. I remember a number of years ago when my associate dean, he asked me to join him for coffee. And after a few moments of the usual BS, he got to the point and he asked me if I used the phrase bitches and bling in the classroom. Surprised, I admitted to it before providing the context of the discussion, which he completely understood, and that was that. Context is everything, people. Anyway, the best part of this discussion is that I was ratted out by one of my colleagues. Seriously, and if you're reading or watching this, know this. I know who you are. Apparently, one of my students posted on social media that, quote, Dr. Levin said bitches and bling in class today, end quote. Now, my colleague saw this and reported me. You'd think, being an English professor, that this person would know a little something about context. But apparently, some English professors are also bad readers. Anyway, so yes, there was a time when rap music slowly degenerated into the realm of bitches and bling, only to inevitably be saved and revitalized by Biggie, Jay-Z, Eminem, and Kendrick. I'm sorry, Kanye's dead to me. Dead. And no, I don't need to take any more time on this assessment. On a side note, it was this exact class that I taught in 2016. So I love this class. I learned so much. But in 2016, when I was introduced to Kendrick for the first time, thank you, student, whomever you were. And I was just utterly floored. Seriously, it took just the title of the album to make me feel as if I was hearing rap music again for the first time. To pimp a butterfly. Now, in terms of poetry, my mind went straight back to Coleridge's definition. The balance of discordant qualities. To pimp a butterfly. Man, you can't get more poetic than that. Listen, I try not to be too hyperbolic, but Kendrick might just be the Bob Dylan of rap music. Nevertheless, the question must be asked. How are we to understand the difference between exploitation and affirmation? What I mean by this is that, the general reading public or listeners are oftentimes, we're way too quick to judge, especially when it comes to women and their utilization of sexuality, whether physically or lyrically. I mean, people freak out, and our culture loves the slut shame. Alas, the answer to my question is not an easy one. My instinct is to go back to my talk, one of my previous talks about cancel culture. Yeah, we do need to take our time, except with Kanye. He's had enough time. But in this case, I'm going to provide a little lesson concerning critical analysis. So, in his preface to Shakespeare, Dr. Samuel Johnson, man, I go to this dude a lot. He argues that to be a good critic, we must compare works of art. A sentiment that I previously echoed at the end of our last talk. And this certainly helps in our present analysis. So I'm going to digress briefly back to sexuality, away from rap music, and we're going to compare two very similar artists in terms of their utilization of sexuality and whether we can understand exploitation versus affirmation a little more lucidly. So, both of these artists began with a cutesy image, becoming famous, polished celebrities at an early age, prior to transitioning into more, Lolita-esque adolescence, before becoming full-on sex symbols through both their appearance and their lyrics. Yes, I am talking about Britney Spears and Miley Cyrus. So, once again, our friend Ethos is going to be critical in our assessment. What do we know about these people in terms of their character and credibility? And how can we apply that to their art and image in terms of affirming or exploiting their sexuality? So let's begin with Britney. Don't worry, I'm not going to her trial with her father. Now, listen, I freaking love Britney. I'm a slave for you. Oops, I did it again. Toxic. I mean, these are my jams. Okay. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, what do we know about the lyrics to these songs? Where do they come from? Britney does not write her songs, either musically or lyrically. I used to picture some kind of, back alley, dingy Hollywood basement where there were, writers, churning out lyrics for artists, underpaid writers churning out lyrics for their artists. But this is not actually the case. Actually, a lot of artists write music lyrics and sell them to other artists. This is exactly how Lady Gaga started out. And let's not forget, figures such as Robert Hunter, who wrote for the Grateful Dead. You're going to hear all about those hippies soon enough. Or Bernie Taupin for Elton John. With the latter two examples, there clearly exists a symbiotic relationship with the musicians that allows them to more or less collaborate. I'm not sure it's the exact same thing as simply purchasing music lyrics. Man, my voice is going quickly. So, I'm a slave for you. It didn't come from Britney. She just sings the lyrics. Sings, kinda. All right. She certainly went into the studio and gave it her best. As she had probably a group of producers there with their computers to record all of her takes, cut and pasting together all those moments when she, hit the right note, and then puts them together for that perfect song on the CD or now what we stream. But the live performances, everyone knows that Britney lip syncs her songs. Don't get me wrong, Britney is a hell of a performer, and I'm still very upset that I never got the chance to see her residency in Vegas. But there's something about performance that doesn't exactly detract from the art. But when the performance, at least the prioritizing of performance, becomes the main focus over the music and the lyrics, then, well, I think we're heading into a discussion of different forms of art and possibly exploitation. Indeed, performance, listen, it is an art form. There's no doubt about it. But with Britney, the dancing, the clothes, the light show, the sexuality, all of it actually usurps the words, or at least the relevancy of the words themselves. The words that did not come from Britney in the first place. Is Britney musically inclined? I still cringe at the thought of that reality show, which did exist, in the early 2000s. Oh, it was with her and Justin. And Justin, I think in one of the episodes, I have the hiccups. No hiccups. Anyway, no hiccups. Anyway, one of the episodes, Justin was attempting to give Brittany, a guitar lesson. I might be hallucinating this, but I'm pretty sure it happened. It didn't go well, if I'm recalling this correctly. I hope she's been practicing the past few decades. Again, if I'm not hallucinating this entire occurrence. But alas, it's clear that with Britney, the image, her body, the display of her body at the same time, along with all the pop and circumstance, that takes center stage. Indeed, sex sells. Now, how about Miley, whose career trajectory is quite similar to Britney's, especially in terms of how they both morphed from innocent child stars into overly sexual or sexualized artists. Within a matter of years, Miley went from Hannah Montana to the Bangers tour in 2013-14, complete with giant on-stage phallic objects and Miley faux masturbating on stage, which actually never really shocked me that much. I mean, Madonna had done the same thing at the 1985 MTV Music Awards and in a frickin' wedding dress. So it is kind of a derivative gesture, I would think. If you need another example, just go to the Divinals for their song I Touch Myself from 1990 and the video. That might have been the music video when I actually became a man. I'm not sure, but anyway. However, let's get into Miley's background. And what first needs to be acknowledged is location. Similar to Letitia Elizabeth Landon, Miley had a clear advantage in terms of location. Not only was she a progeny of a famous artist, but taking this a step further, she got her first guitar lesson, I think at the age of like 3 or 4, from the Cyrus family neighbor, Willie Nelson. Yeah, on a side note, not only does Miley's artistry start to make more sense, but so does her early affinity for smoking weed. So Miley was artistically inclined from the beginning. What about her lyrics? I encourage you to listen to her outstanding 2017 interview on the Howard Stern Show, where she acknowledges how she used writers, similar to Britney, to get her foot in the door post Hannah Montana. It's not a shock that her team purchased the lyrics to Party in the USA. But as she's matured, her lyrics have become her own. Case in point, Miley wrote Wrecking Ball, about her relationship with Thor's brother. She really hit her stride with the collaborative effort, Nothing Breaks Like a Heart, co-produced by Mark Ronson. What about her singing? I mean, go ahead. I mean, we're on YouTube, so just pull it up. Pull up Miley's cover of Jolene by her godmother, Dolly Parton. There's no need for lip syncing. Miley's got some serious pipes. Also, if you watch that video of her cover of Jolene during the backyard sessions, I mean, dude, that band she's working with, they're just awesome. I just want to jam with them so bad, or at least just be their friends. They look so cool. Now, performance is key with Miley as well. There's lots of dancing, costume changes, and twerking involved. But considering, our analysis of her background, her pop and circumstance does not quite usurp her music and lyrics to the extent that we saw with Britney. Similarly, listening to her interviews, there's a sense of, I think, self-awareness with Miley that signifies less of a constructed image than there is with Britney. At the time of the Bangers tour, her collaborative work with Wayne Coyne and the Flaming Lips, it kind of suggests a foray into the realm of more avant-garde music, one that is both playful and earnest. As this type of experimentation in the world of art, symbolizes a testing of artistry, and more importantly, sexuality and what it means to be a woman. We'll hear more about, parodical art and its connection to earnestness in a couple talks later when I get to Wet Leg. So excited for that. But there's a strong sense of self-awareness and choice with Miley. There was actually something quite tongue-in-cheek about the over-the-top sexuality during the Bangers tour. It was almost as if Miley was winking at us, aware that what she was actually doing was really mocking, those talking heads, the radical right-wing Christians primarily, who were so offended by sex. So Miley took it to another level, and the performance actually was more laughable than titillating. Meaning Miley was laughing at us, at the audience. I actually saw her at Austin City Limits in 2021. And then beyond appreciating her new foray into the world of hard rock music, I heard her speak out about women's rights, using her platform to, voice her political stance, which can sometimes be off putting at a live show, even with my mother's Milk Pearl Jam, who have no problem voicing their political stances, which, sometimes can be a little bit of a buzzkill. However, it was kind of refreshing to hear it from Miley, especially in a state like Texas, where many state politicians have no problem treating women like they are second class citizens. Hmm. Point being, there's a large portion of the populace that's just ready to dismiss women as soon as they see some cleavage, a little midriff, any provocative movements, or lyrical suggestiveness. Yes, you out there who dismiss so quickly, well, once again, we have bad readers who do not understand the importance of nuance. Now, I'm not dismissing Britney's performance as a form of art, nor am I saying that Britney does not affirm what it means to be a woman. However, I am arguing that by being a tad more fastidious in terms of readership and our ability to read, we are able to locate those nuanced characteristics that help us, be better critics and understand the varying levels of affirmation as opposed to exploitation. We see these two similar artists being sexually provocative, but understanding where the lyrics come from, their ability as actual singers, their musical ability as a whole, then I think we understand how their images and words can and cannot be seen as more or less affirmative. Now, as I said, both Britney and Miley are performers. Yet with performance, we must also ask ourselves what aspects of the performance actually, accentuates lyricism or detracts from the lyricism. Seriously, think about someone like Jimi Hendrix. That dude was clearly a performer, destroying his guitar and amp, lighting his guitar on fire, stroking the neck of his Fender as if it were, well, an extension of his body. I think I just did that. Whoops. Yet this performative aspect of Jimmy, it clearly did not detract from his music or his words, as both aspects of his art, it signified, a type of revelry or a Dionysian release. On a side note, any reference to Dionysus, typically brings with it a sense of overt masculinity. I think I briefly mentioned this in our previous discussion with Pearl Jam. However, this is a mistake, and I think you can blame Oliver Stone's depiction of Jim Morrison for this mistake. Yeah, this is a reference to Oliver Stone's 1991 film The Doors. If you've seen it, you know what I mean. If you haven't seen it, I kind of recommend you see it. I recall viewing the film while in high school, and in the following days, witnessing numerous, 16 or 17-year-old male peers, mimicking or at least trying to look and act just like Val Kilmer's depiction of Jim Morrison. In retrospect, it was really creepy. Dionysian revelry, I think, is androgynous, excuse me. And if you need an example, look no further than Nancy Wilson from Heart. Seriously, go ahead and check out her live performances of Barracuda or Crazy on You or whatever. Not only does she kick so much ass, she goes wild, and it is truly Dionysian. Point being, as audience members, even with all of the visual hoopla, we do not lose track, of the music with Nancy Wilson or Jimi Hendrix. Indeed, the performance actually accentuates the music. Now, you go to the MTV Video Music Awards and a scantily clad Britney wrapped in a giant snake. Do we even remember what song she was singing? Does it even matter? I mean, I'm pretty sure it was "I'm a Slave for You," but what the fuck does wrapping yourself in a snake have to do with being someone's sexual or intimate slave? So when the performance usurps the lyric, well, that's when we see the agency of the words themselves become marginalized. So finally, accentuation and detraction, they go hand in hand with our discussion of exploitation and affirmation. In returning to Alanis and NWA, we come to understand that the inherent poetry within their use of expletives and vulgar lyricism does not by any means detract from their words. But on the other hand, their word choice clearly accentuates their poetry and political power as both African Americans and women. I know, I can hear all of you out there. T Swizzle doesn't have to resort to this type of vulgarity to be a woman. Uh huh. Tay Tay's image is pretty clean. Even with her recent turn to being more outspoken politically, and apparently being a rabid football fan. Yeah, and you know what? In her mid 30s and with the release of her quote unquote poetry album, Tay Tay seems to have constructed a more mature, risque self, utilizing expletives her last few albums, and even sexual innuendos, as well as alluding to, struggles with mental health, all things that come with maturing into being a fully functional adult. Still, Taylor's very smart construction of her artistic self doesn't seem to break from 2018 Taylor or even 2013 Taylor. They're all kind of the same. And for the most part, she kind of seems to get a pass. And no one would ever put her in the category that was reserved for third wave feminism. Even with her important lyric to her song Man or The Man or whatever it's called. Taylor actually seems to even be above such trite politics. However, do a quick search on that machine in front of you. Go ahead, plug in Taylor Swift and Alanis Morissette. Press enter. And what do you find? Yep, 2015. Taylor, her 5-night stint at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, bringing up a special guest every night. And who does she bring up? Alanis Morissette. And they perform You Ought to Know together. Yeah. Shocking? Shouldn't be. Taylor talked on stage about the importance of that lyric and of Alanis as an early source of inspiration. Even the squeaky clean Taylor of 2015, finds power in the words, in the poetry of Alanis Morissette. And she didn't choose to sing, hand in my pocket or ironic. Alanis, I'm not going to give you any shit concerning the definition of that word. Taylor could have been, safe, but she didn't. No, T Swizzle chose You Ought to Know, the most powerful of Alanis's lyrics, because it affirms women by slapping men in the face, letting them know that not only can women be pissed off, but all of the things that come along with being a rock star, all of that can also be accomplished by women as well. It's inspirational, even to a young, proper girl from the sticks of Pennsylvania who moved to Nashville to become a worldwide phenomenon. I guess if I called Kendrick the Bob Dylan of rap music, I might as well call Tay Tay, the Bob Dylan of pop music. Now, I seriously doubt that Alanis read Letitia Elizabeth Landon. It's highly unlikely, considering Landon's, very non-canonical status outside of the university. But Christina Rossetti read Landon. Elizabeth Barrett Browning read Landon. Virginia Woolf read them all. Edna St. Vincent Millay probably read most of them. Sylvia Plath definitely read most of them. Maya Angelou read her ass off. Joni Mitchell and Joan Baez, probably read a lot of them. Stevie definitely listened to Joan and Joni. You see where I'm going, my friends? Doors need to be opened, especially for the marginalized and the repressed. And as we learned in the previous chapter, poetry destroys boundaries. Poetry also opens doors. And unfortunately, many doors tend to be locked. Alas, getting through a locked door takes effort. Sometimes it takes a sledgehammer. I'm going to get really cheesy right now. Sometimes it might even take a wrecking ball. Oh, that's incredible. Yeah, my voice is gone. I'm going to take a day or two off. Woo! That was fun. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something.